part 2 of Milk and Bourbon's 5th episode. So I'm going to call it 5 Bravo. This one's going to center on both the book Our Man in Havana by Greene, and I'm going to follow it up with a tasting of our 24-year Rhetoric, which is a part of the Orphan Barrel selection. Really excited about that. I don't think I've ever tasted anything 24 years old. Usually that would be a negative thing, but with bourbons, the layman would typically say that the older the better. So let's dive right in. Like I said before, this is going to be a bit of a comparison while also naming some things unique to this book and then also that bourbon. So one thing I wanted to lead off with is the different backgrounds of these two authors. Jasper Fforde, the writer of Early Riser, my last book that I gave a bit of a review on. He's been writing since about 88 in earnest, when he got his first book picked up after being rejected several times, maybe even more than several, but he finally got picked up, and it's called The Ire Affair, and it kind of set the tone for what kind of author he was going to be from then on out. And prior to that, Jasper Fforde had been working in the film industry. He'd worked on The Mask of Zorro and Goldeneye. So he's always been a part of the entertainment business. Greene was a bit more of an author that just happened to be an author because of the intrigue of his lifestyle. So he was kind of a wanderlust. So he was traveling often, early and often. He was alive for the majority of the 20th century, so travel was starting to open up really nicely, and travel across continents was really becoming more streamlined, so he took full advantage of that. And a lot of his books reflect his travels. So Jasper Fforde kind of creates these alternate realities because his imagination, is incredible, and he's witty and zany and just strange. He's a strange writer, but it's very entertaining. Greene takes... He went through a period in the 40s and the 50s where a lot of his books centered on places that were undergoing revolution. So there was one written in Haiti. There was one written in Africa. There was this one that was written in Cuba. And they all seem to be happening right as interesting political changes were happening. And he would set these characters, drop them into these scenes. So with Our Man in Havana, obviously Havana, Cuba, it's about this vacuum cleaner salesman who's originally British, who ended up in Cuba for whatever reason. His wife has just left him. He's left with a 16-year-old daughter who's just so happens to be very beautiful, but also very vapid. And he doesn't have much money. Vacuum sales, I guess, are down in the late 50s when Mr. Greene wrote this book. But he is approached by an agent with MI6 named Hawthorne and is kind of forced into the job of being a local cell informant to MI6. Now, he could have rejected it, but because of his failing income, he chose to do this. Now, Mr. Wormold is no spy. And it's kind of funny. Throughout this whole book, I was always like, Mr. Greene has to kill his main character because this guy is just kind of trash, especially in the beginning. And he doesn't end up actually establishing a network with more local informants, but he makes this story that he does. And he creates all these expenses that MI6 is willing to pay because he starts giving them some juicy details. Unknowingly, MI6 is taking all these bits of information off of storytelling. So Mr. Wormold is looking through the newspaper, getting names, getting occupations, and creating, either flat out creating these characters or building upon people that he finds in the news. And he creates this vast web of bullshit, and MI6 is eating it up. And I think that's funny because Graham Greene if you read about his background, there have been several times where he displayed that he was far more likely to support the individual than to support the country. For instance, there was a friend of his that grew up in intelligence in Great Britain, and he was eventually ousted as a Russian spy, a double agent, and Graham Greene maintained that friendship with him, despite, the fervor which people usually have for supporting their countries. So he ended up sticking with the guy over the country, and he does that often. And he even explains at the end of Our Man in Havana, I think it's almost like he's arguing for why he would do such a thing. He creates a character who initially is sent over to assist Wormold and take over his contacts, to be his secretary, essentially, or I guess his second-hand man. But they end up falling in love, and at the end, when Wormold comes clean, she kind of supports him. Now, I'm not going to give away how that goes and what leads up to it, but what's funny is throughout this book, and this is kind of where Graham Greene shows some of that black comedy, so that dark comedy that is used, and it was especially popular during this time in the 40s and 50s. So the plot leads to this. Wormold's created all of these different cells, different people, and it's strange that even some of the characters that he creates, they match up with real people in Havana. And people start dying. And things start coming true with these made-up reports that he's had. And it's blowing Mr. Wormold's mind. And it forces him to contend with enemies that believe that what he's supplying to MI6 is actually factual. So he's now having to contend with people that want to assassinate him. And in doing so, what started off as him just trying to make some extra money for his daughter and her tastes lead him to be, at least behave very similarly to how a veteran agent would, or at least how I would imagine them to react. And so he actually starts doing well at this job. And I'm not going to give away the end, because it's cool. What I can tell you is that Mr. Greene is definitely throughout this whole thing just inserting these political themes into the book, his own beliefs. And it also is poking fun at intelligence agencies and really the British government as a whole. It includes corrupt cops, inept intelligence agencies, distrust, deceit, and ultimately love, like I mentioned, with his secretary turned right-hand man turned lover. And this book does an excellent job of... There's no white and black in this story. It's all shades of gray. The protagonist is maybe the protagonist, and then the antagonists are maybe the antagonists, and sometimes they go back and forth. Sometimes best friends become worse enemies. It's humorous throughout, kind of in a morbid way, much like Early Risers was, in that there's some heady things being broached, some themes that are very serious, but they do it in a way that's easily digestible and also very easy to remember because of that humor. So Mr. Greene does this thing where his novels display a consistent preoccupation with the deceitful, sinful, and moral failure of the individuals, but he also reflects it even further up the chain into larger societal and social settings. And he kind of has like the entities reflect the individuals, and that's what I was talking about with the graying of the protagonist and antagonist, because you see that while Mr. Wormold is a good man, Dr. Hasselbacher is a good man, Chief of Police Segura is a bad man. There's still also some... It's interesting. You grow to like Segura, you grow to dislike Wormold at times, and he just does a really excellent job of having that balance and making these characters complex and believable, and I really enjoyed it. So one thing that I wanted to mention is that both Mr. Greene and Mr. Ford have these opinions about government, about society in general, about corporations, and they're generally negative, which I understand. I do understand that. And I wanted to caution readers from here on out, because I see this not so often with books, maybe with books, but in modern times I more often see it with these social activism campaigns that are headed by celebrities. And it's that, be careful who you choose as a role model. Why would I care about the opinions of the Miley Cyruses, the Kim Kardashians, the Justin Biebers of the world? What's granted them the knowledge, the intelligence, the maturity to have an effect or have a way to sway me in my opinions? So I think it's very important to have your own thoughts and not to be so easily swayed by what famous people say, because why are they the experts? Now with Mr. Greene and Mr. Ford, you can tell the intelligence level of these guys are probably higher than your typical celebrity, because I can't even imagine the amount of work it takes to put a book out. So are they intelligent men? Yes. Do you accept what they believe without doing some research of your own? No. And I think that's what's a huge issue in today's society, is that we're inundated with information to the point where we can barely process any of it because we're just overwhelmed with it. And so we latch on to what people that we respect believe in. And I think that's a dangerous groupthink way of behaving. So I just urge people to form your own opinions, but form those own opinions based off of research. Don't just make your opinion in line with Republicans or Democrats or Mr. Greene or Mr. Ford. Make them based off of what you're doing and what you're learning. To finish out the book, what's crazy about this is that I chose these two books at random. And it's the common way these two guys attack social issues and the way they use black comedy satire to poke fun at those things is very cool. I thought that was how serendipitous, right? And I also wanted to point out that Our Man in Havana was written in 1958, and the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Bay of Pigs were in the early 60s. So it's almost prophetic, his writing of what's going on in this book. And if you read it, you'll see what I'm talking about. And I've seen this with books in the past. With Our Man in Havana, the issues that he's bringing up on the individual, corporate, government level are still issues that we face today, 60 years later. So I always think it's pretty interesting to see how authors can sometimes, like 1984 with George Orwell, how did his creative thought process align so nicely with what's happening in current days? So very interesting book. What do I rate it? Early Risers was my favorite this year. I think I gave it a 4.5. I'm going to give Our Man in Havana a 3.8. The writing style was just a bit different for Mr. Greene, and I think it's more dated. His concepts were fresh as ever, but just the way he wrote wasn't as interesting to me. So I'm going to give it 3.8 out of 5 stars. And that leads me to the next segment, the comparative analysis, of our bourbons. So yesterday I had the McKenna 10-year, and today I'm going to try the Rhetoric 24-year. Now, what's cool about this line of Orphan Barrels releases is that they've been continually releasing progressively older bourbons from this same batch that they found. Now, if you're not sure or aren't familiar with what an orphan barrel is it's just a barrel that, let's say, X company shut down in the 80s. They couldn't support continuing operations, and they leave barrels behind because they owe money, and that's part of their way of paying it back is this product. And so it kind of falls into disrepair, and people go out and seek these orphan barrels out, these barrels that have been left behind, because they provide a really unique experience that can't be redone. There's only so many barrels of Rhetoric. Eventually, they're going to run out. But what's cool is they've been re-releasing it every year. So there's a 25-year out right now. This 24-year was their 12th release alone. And now let me read this flavor profile to you guys. The nose has a noted flavor of leather. Yep. The palate has a complex of both spices and dark sweets. It has a long finish, much like the McKenna, with none of the notes at the end, the finish being too surprising. They're following the palate pretty nicely, mirror it quite closely, which is something that I haven't seen as much with the other bourbons that I've tried. They usually try to throw something different into the finish to kind of surprise you, give you that little, wow, that was good. So these guys are sticking to their guns. Their palate of dark sweets and spices is also what their finish is. 24-year-old bourbon, the oldest bourbon I've ever tried. Without further ado, let's try this. What I think is that some days you just kind of are ready to receive a new bourbon. And then other days, for whatever reason, you just don't have the taste for it. Maybe that's just me, but the palate of this Rhetoric, it's so smooth. I don't taste the leather. I definitely get a lot of spice. To me, that's the predominant flavor. So if you like a spicy bourbon, this is high up there. But it finishes so nicely, and it's... sometimes when you just... you take that first drink, and sometimes it'll kick your ass. Sometimes it gets you feeling in the zone. I don't know. Maybe it's just like how you go into it that determines how that happens. But that was a great first drink. I was excited for this one too because it's the oldest bourbon I've ever tried. It's an orphan barrel, which I thought was cool, and I'm possibly being swayed by their marketing strategy because I don't know, maybe orphan barrels are more common than I think, but I know that there's only so much of this one, and so I wanted to try it. I've always wanted to try it. I was worried to crack it, honestly, because you usually save these types of things for huge deals, but I wanted to give you guys a review on it. So, rating, man, it still hasn't impressed me more than Long Branch. Long Branch, I think I either gave a 4.1 or a 4.2. I'm gonna give Rhetoric a 4. It's up there in the top 3 that I've tried since starting this podcast. I'm hoping that I don't start like bunching up on the low end and the high end, and I don't have anything in between. So hopefully as the bourbons go, I'll start stringing these out a little bit more. But standalone, not thinking about other bourbons too much. I give it a 4 out of 5. That ends it. We've reached the end of the second half of episode 5 of Milk and Bourbon. I appreciate you coming back 2 days in a row. I wanted to try something different. I have a buddy that's created a podcast called Six Pack Rant. And he started doing this style where he releases a little bit every day. And I think it's exciting to see his channel grow. And I think it's something that I'm trying to learn from other podcasts, the best way to do this. So if you have any thoughts, anything that you want to talk about, if you disagree with my assessment on the books or the bourbons, if you think that I should try some sort of different books in the future or some different bourbons in the future, maybe you want me to try a Canadian whiskey versus a Kentucky bourbon, I'm going to tell you that based off principle, I'm going to choose the Kentucky bourbon. But if you want to see something different, hit me up on my Instagram, Milk and Bourbon, MILKN Bourbon. I'd love to hear some feedback, and I love that you guys came back around. It's been an exciting journey so far, and I hope you guys continue to stick with me. Peace out. Y'all thought, I almost forgot. Man, I almost messed that up, didn't I? As a toast to the end of the 2-part series of episode 5 of Milk and Bourbon, I give you my toast. Up to it, down to it, damn the man that can't do it. That's a wrap.